Have you ever wanted to make a trip to an exotic island, probably somewhere in the Pacific? Palm trees and coconuts, beautiful beaches and volcanic mountaintops. Certainly, millions of Americans back in the golden age of television would tune in every Saturday night for an adventure on Fantasy Island, where guests would be greeted by a smiling Mr. Rourke in tattoo, his assistant, all decked out in the white suit, and everyone would get a nice tropical drink to share a toast for the beginning of their adventures. And at the beginning of the pandemic crisis that was sweeping the world, quite a few stories emerged about tourists on exotic excursions aboard luxury ocean liners, traveling to exotic ports of call, and some totally unaware that the world was changing around them. The New York Post even reported on a traveler who was very aware that her cruise was being interrupted, but in her travel log, unfazed by whatever details had inconvenienced her itinerary, she wrote about her enthusiasm for the possibility of seeing some beautiful destinations for which she had not planned. And as funny as that account might appear, many Americans and others across the world were coming up a steep learning curve to learn about a novel coronavirus, learning new terms like social distancing, and with no comprehension that within just a few months, everything they knew before would change, with closed businesses, facial coverings, daily infection counts, and weekly updates. And shifting focus to protect themselves, perhaps some lost track about how events were unfolding around the world, like on a distant volcanic island, about 20 times the size of the nation's capital in landmass, with only about 166,000 people, and the closest land mass to the Marianas Trench, the island territorial possession of the United States known as Guam, where there is a naval base, but also, at least since 2003, the forward operating base for the nation's strategic bomber force, which was withdrawn in April. One story that did make the national press about Guam were the events surrounding the COVID-19 outbreak that had occurred aboard the nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, the USS Theodore Roosevelt. According to all of the press accounts, the commander, Captain Brett Crozier, had decided to put the safety of his men first, and it angered the president, and many in the press came to his defense while the presidential primary season was unfolding to celebrate the naval officer whose men cheered him, and as he walked down the gangplank, having been relieved from his command after risking his career, falling on his sword, and challenging the administration. Senators Tim Kaine and Mark Warner even wrote a harshly worded letter to the Department of the Navy, rebuking them for firing the commander who had sought compliant quarantine facilities ashore, but was frustrated by an unresponsive chain of command and delayed by bureaucracy at a time that demanded decisive action to save the lives of sailors, because it was not a time of war, and they should not have to risk their lives during a time of peace, even though battling an invisible enemy.
The voting for a contentious election is over, and everyone has done their duty and cast their ballot. But while we are waiting for the final results, let's take a little mental vacation and imagine a salesman who wanted to sell you a trip to Fantasy Island, complete with Mr. Rourke tattoo, the seaplane ride, and tropical drink to toast you off on your exotic adventure. You are an intelligent person and are probably savvy enough to contend with a slick salesman. And just like you were able to make a decision about Captain Crozier and his decision, you're probably able to negotiate this slick sales pitch. You know the science of pandemic. If you were in Captain Crozier's position, you probably would have done the same thing too, because it was the right thing to do. And he stood up against the president, just like you would. Probably. But looking for a moment at that decision, let's just take some time to think over that decision again. Imagine a ship with 4,000 soldiers infected with a potentially deadly pandemic pathogen. We are now months past that day when Captain Crozier wrote his memorandum and had more facts. And perhaps because of his decision, only one member of his crew succumbed to the infection. But now take a look at the island where he intended to save his men. Would you, to save your sailors, let them depart a military base to expose themselves and their potentially lethal infection to people who live on that beautiful island? Think about the science. How about if most of them were poor and old with median income that was less than $2,000 per month? How about if you knew that the island had found its first case of infection about 2 weeks before the aircraft carrier arrived, but was at the same time being asked to locate facilities to quarantine about 150 airmen who had already been stationed on the island and were also requesting accommodations off base? How about if you knew that the island had begun its lockdowns long before any state in America, was doing tests and tracer contacts and trying to do all of the right things even though they didn't have everything and they couldn't ask the president? They had already begun their lockdown, suspending social gatherings, even closing medical facilities to prevent a deadly contagion from wiping out the entire population, just as smallpox had done for many Native Americans. How about if they would be forced to reopen the hotels that they had closed to protect their fellow islanders? But fearing losing federal contracts, they reluctantly yielded to the pressure brought on when suddenly several admirals began barking orders at them, with the support of the national press and politicians who opposed the president. On the day that 3 soldiers reported a sick call aboard the Theodore Roosevelt, the island of Guam had its first fatality in 27 cases. By September, their first child died. Their cases jumped from 27 to over 5,000 by mid-September, attaining a 10% infection rate for the entire island population. The only island in the entire Pacific where COVID-19 has appeared to take hold, and also the only island where 4,000 sailors were sent into local hotels on an island of elderly and poor indigenous people, forced to open their hotels because they feared that they would die, while 88 Native Islanders by the end of October were dead. You know the science. Do you still think that you would have done the same thing? At the time of your decision, were you really considering all of the facts and potential consequences of that decision, or were you thinking about something else? Were you thinking about an election and somebody that you did not particularly agree with? Or did a trip to Fantasy Island permit you to abandon just a little rationality, permitting you to succumb to emotions that impeded your ability to make the right decision at the time? A good salesman knows how to push all of the right buttons to make the sale, and sometimes later we regret the things that we bought. All men are not angels, and sometimes the best way to make a decision is to admit that we don't have all of the answers or all of the facts. My name is Major Mike Webb, and by God, I am running for governor of Virginia. Stand with me, and together we shall overcome. Honest.
This advertisement was authorized by Mike Webb.